After studying this module, you shall be able to understand level of processing, what is PDP, which is Parallel Distributed Processing Model, further about Atkinson and Shiffrin, and with that Toolwing's model. In the previous modules, students, we have learnt about how memories are formed, how further we can remember them. Therefore, it is the ability to create new memories, store them for periods of time and recall them when they are needed that allow us to learn and interact with the world around us. This study of human memory has been a subject of science and philosophy for thousands of years and has become one of the major topics of interest within cognitive psychology. Keeping this interest in mind, many theories have been formulated to explain how the incoming information is processed, which can be used in usable form in future. This model also focuses on different theories that try and explain this view only. Level of processing model, which is the one we are going to discuss here in the current phase. This model explains that information which has been more deeply processed or which has been processed according to their meaning rather than on the basis of sound or any other physical characteristics of the sound and the information, which can further be remembered more efficiently and for much longer period of time. Craig and Lockhart in 1972 gave this theory. They assumed that attention and perceptual processes at the time of learning determined what information is stored in the long-term memory. The key theoretical assumption made by Craig and Lockhart in 1972 were the following ones, which we are going to discuss now. The level of depth of processing of a stimulus has a larger effect on the information to be remembered. Deeper levels of analysis produce more elaborate, longer lasting, stronger memory traces than do shallow levels of processing. Therefore, they accepted the notion that perception involves the rapid analysis of stimuli at number of levels of stages. The initial stages basically analyzed the levels of processing, and they had discussed about how the things are to be taken into account. It has also been referred that in the initial stages we analyze stimuli into sensory features such as lines, angles, frequency, and etc. Later stages use the results of the preliminary analysis to match stimuli against stored representations, which is basically your pattern recognition, and to extract meaning from those messages. After stimuli has been recognized, it may still undergo further processing. Let's take an example. By triggering associations or images on the subject's past experiences, the chief idea being that processing involves a series or hierarchy of stages, so that meaning may be assigned to the stimuli depending on factors such as nature of the stimuli. When the input is to be taken, we refer to certain aspects out here. First is the structural processing which we follow. Second is the acoustic processing which we take into account, and third is the semantic processing. This shows how information is being processed. Let's consider an example to explain this concept more clearly. Suppose you are shown a word CAR on a screen, which is car. You are asked to repeat whether the word was in capital letters or in lowercase. The word itself does not have to be processed very much at all. but its visual characteristics needed to be entered in your conscious attention. Instead of this, if you would have been asked to process its meaning, not just its looks, then that would require more mental effort from your side. Thinking about the meaning of the word into deeper levels results in longer retention of the word. This is referred to as levels of processing. Let us now discuss about the PDP model, which is your parallel distributed processing model. In this model, memory is seen as a stimulus. All at the same time, it processes it with the creation and storage of memories taking places across a series of mental networks across the brain. This was basically given by McClelland in 1988. The basic assumption of this model is that mental processes takes place through highly interconnected units, which can take on the activation value and can further communicate to other units also. Units are basically the simple processing elements that stand for possible hypothesis, which could be about the nature of things, such as letters in its display, the rules of writing letters, or playing a note on the piano, etc. A neuron in the brain is a type of unit that combines with other neurons in a parallel processing mode to form layer systems, or basically the larger systems. Units are also basically organized into modules, such as atoms are organized into molecules. In the model, information presented leaves traces behind when it has been passed through. These traces change in the strength of the connections between individual units in the model. A memory trace, such as your friend's name, may be distributed over many different connections. The storage of information as may be presented in a form which is basically your friend's name is thought to be storage of information as maybe your friend's name is thought to be content addressable. That is, we can assess the information in memory on the basis of the attributes or its attributes which are involved in it. As we were taking an example of your friend, you can also recall your friend's name if you are provided with some cue. Maybe it could be a picture of your friend also. We have also shown the groupings of basically mutually exclusive information through a diagrammatic representation, which you can see it. In this figure, we are able to see a concept of jets and sharks. In this figure, the grouping of the periphery includes mutually exclusive information. All of the characters and attributes are connected in a mutually excitatory network. If the network is well, or if the network is working well practiced, that is, if connections between units are established, then we can retrieve the properties of a given individual. We can further explain this concept with an example. We have to retrieve the attributes of Ralph. By probing the system with Ralph, there is only one Ralph in the system. You can recall that he is a Chet in his 30s, attended junior high school, is single and a drug user. We can also retrieve two other names which are there, which is Ralph and Mike. In this example, more information would be needed to be specific. In other words, it is a representation. When we have said that Ralph is in 30s, we can also recall that he is a Jet in his 30s, attended junior high school, is single and a drug pusher. In effect, we have recalled a representation of Ralph. In other words, Ralph is what he is. However, if we assess the system from another angle and with less than complete information, we would end up with ambiguous results. For example, if we search for a person who is Chet, is in his 30s, attended junior high school and is single, we retrieve two names, Ralph and Mike. In this example, more information would be needed to be specific about what we are looking for. The qualities associated with this model are that it can account for complex learning, the type of memory operations we encounter in everyday life. Therefore, it allows people to retrieve many different aspects of memory all at once, allowing much faster reactions and decisions. The next module which we would be discussing out here is the Atkinson and Shiffrin model, which was given in 1968. The first attempt at developing a general model of memory was proposed by Atkinson and Shiffrin in 1968. Their model proposes that memory consists of three separate and distinct storage systems. For this reason, the model is called the multi-store model, which is also referred as MSM. This theory is based on the idea that humans are like digital computers and that it takes on items of information, processes them further either in steps or in stages, and then produce an output further. This model builds on the idea of three memory stores and tries to explain how they work together. The model also sees memory as a flow of information through a system. The model further takes on any information or process this information, and it can also represent in the form of a flow diagram. We can see in this diagram, which is the three multi-store model, where there is an environment or basically which is an input provider. It passes through our sensory memory, which further enters into our short-term memory. It can either go to your long-term memory, which is after going through rehearsals and following a rehearsal loop, or it can be retrieved from the short-term memory to the long-term memory. To further expand or to further explain this figure, we can see that information is assumed to flow from the environment through a series of very brief sensory memories that are perhaps best regarded as part of your perceptual system into a limited capacity of your short-term store. They propose that the longer an item resides in the store, the greater the chances or the probability that it gets transferred to your long-term memory. Long-term memory refers to continuing storage of information for longer period of time, and short-term memory referred to be as active memory, which basically stores a limited amount of information. Amnesic patients were assumed to have a difficult or deficit in this long-term memory system, and short-term memory patients in the short-term store. Now let us understand about the major components of this model, which is the Atkinson and Shiffrin model. Short-term memory stores the information or the incoming information from the senses. The information received from the outer environment can be held for a brief duration in the sensory channels such as your vision, hearing, touch, and further on. The model also assumes that there is a separate store for each of these five senses. The store is very brief and a vast majority of information can be lost there. This storage function is basically your sensory channels, is referred as sensory register. Only information that is relevant or important can be attended and passes through this short-term memory and further resides into your long-term memory. Forgetting from the sensory store is by decay. Now let us understand what is short-term memory. Short-term memory is very fragile and retains information from the sensory register for up to 30 seconds. Material that is rehearsed and is placed in your long-term memory, which can further also pass to your long-term memory. Forgetting from short-term memory is by displacement or by decay. Long-term memory can store information. This information can be stored for a lifetime. Here the information is basically to be stored in the long-term memory and it can be further rehearsed on. The information is stored in a highly organized manner. Forgetting from long-term memory is very decay or it can happen through interference. In this Atkinson and Shiffrin module, we will discuss about the processes which are involved in this module. Attention is the first factor which is involved in this module. Attention is needed to transfer information from the stored or from our senses to the short-term memory. Most stimuli that reaches the short-term memory through our senses are basically ignored because they aren't seen as to be most important. Only relevant or interesting information or material which seems to be interesting or which seems to attract us are to be chosen and which further passes or which further enters into our short-term memory. 99% of the information is lost in this stage. The next point out here is rehearsal. Rehearsal is needed to transfer information from short-term memory to the long-term memory. For example, if a child has to remember the mathematical tables, he can use or he can learn it by saying it loudly. Elaborative rehearsal links the information with existing material or elaborates it in some other way, again as an aid to long-term storage or long-term memory. Evaluations is the next factor out here. The model has simplistic appeal and has been influential in stimulating research. Other models such as the working memory model, let's take the multi-store memory model as starting point and then add to it. Various studies that suggest the existence of two separate stores support this theory. For example, Murdoch in 1962 had basically found out the evidence for a primacy and recency effect. Primacy effect is due to information heard first, being rehearsed and then passed to your long-term memory. And the recency effect is basically any recently heard or seen information and it is still present in your short-term memory. There appears to be a distinction between stores in terms of capacity, duration and encoding. The next module is the Toolwing's module. In Toolwing's basically focused on the nature of the material that is stored in memory and distinguished between two different kinds of memory, episodic and semantic. Later on, he added another category called the procedural memory. He emphasizes that short-term memory constitutes a separate memory system. Toolwing believes that procedural knowledge is the first system of development or developing during your infancy stage, followed by semantic knowledge and further which goes on with your episodic memory. Toolwing model has basically given different kinds of, it shows different kinds of memory which you can see in the figure also. Episodic memory, which basically receives information and stores all the information about into temporary stages or in the form of episodes or events and relations among those events. For example, memories of your first trip to hills or any other event of yours, it could be the first college day of yours, these are all your episodic memory events. These are your particular events or your particular experiences of your life, and it is quite susceptible that you can change these experiences or they can be lost in your way of life. Semantic memory. Semantic memory is the memory that relates to words, concepts, rules and abstract ideas, and it is necessary for the use of language and further concepts. Therefore, it is in an organized knowledge a person possesses about words and the meanings, relationships or relations with those meanings, etc. In our daily life, we frequently retrieve information from our semantic memory that is used in our conversations and in solving problems, because how we use the language depends entirely on the concepts and rules which we are supposed to follow. Toolwing goes on in defining the role of consciousness in understanding the three memory stores or the systems. The three kinds of consciousness are aeronautic, neotic and autoneotic. Simply, neotic is the consciousness of semantic memory. It is an awareness of the internal and external worlds. We know what we address in our world around us or the nearest landmarks to be able to give the correct directions to our house. We know what our address is and what is the nearest landmark to be able to give the correct directions to our house. We can identify our emotions and we can also consider the feeling of joy despite necessarily associating it with an event or at least not consciously. Autoneotic describes the consciousness of episodic memory. It is identified in subjective time without going into great detail. McCoon had criticized the Toolwing's model and primarily on regards to two main areas. First is the definition, where the distinction between semantic and episodic memory is not well enough to be testable, and consequently results of experiments that claim to prove such a distinction must be viewed as inconclusive. And the second one where it has been criticized is on the modeling base, where the processes need to be modeled, not just labeled, since merely labeling them does not provide a theoretical explanations but only a categorization. Thus, whatever we have learned in this module, we can summarize it first referring to the first module out here, which was Craig and Lockhart in 1972 gave a theory on levels of processing. Just to summarize, just to revise what we have learned, students, let us go through what Craig and Lockhart had said. This theory had basically explained the information which has been more deeply processed or which has been processed according to their meaning rather than on the basis of sound, which will be remembered more efficiently. Atkinson and Shiffrin was the next module which we had discussed. Before that, we had also discussed about the parallel distributed processing model, and we have said it is termed as PDP model. In this model, memory is basically seen as simultaneously processing the information with the creation and storage of memories that are taking place across a series of mental networks, where we had also discussed about the units also. Atkinson and Shiffrin in 1968, they made the first attempt in developing a general model of memory. This model basically builds on the ideas of three memory stores and tries to explain how they work together. The three models or the three stores of memory basically explained about its major components, namely sensory memory, short-term memory and long-term memory. Last but not the least, we had also discussed about the Toolwing model, which basically focused on the nature of the material that is to be stored in our memory processes and which is basically distinguished between different kinds of memory. First one was the episodic, semantic and procedural.